So, good evening, everyone. We are starting a new month of February, and during this month, we're going to be talking about community and employment. Um, Trying to build networks and trying to build your teams and making your association with those that can support your child or individual with disabilities in the community is so important, as well as tapping into the services that are available um, to them. So tonight, and for those who don't know who I am, my name is Patty Trum. I'm the parent resource coordinator trainer for the SALT Talks. And each month we hit a different topic that's pertaining to transition. And as I mentioned, it's community employment this month. Last month we talked about independent living. And then going into the spring, which we're hoping for is around the corner, March and April will be looking at guardianship, stable accounts, and things like that. They're a little bit more, they're a lot intense for some of us parents in making that transition into, getting benefits and eligibility processes and stuff. So tonight we're touching on building a supportive network team. And what does that entail? What does that look like? So I brought in, we have three speakers tonight, Elizabeth Risner, Libby Grove, and Vanessa Elliot. Vanessa's from OOD, and Elizabeth and Libby are both from the county board. And I'll let them tell you a little bit about them and what they do. Um, but I've, worked with many of these. I think everybody. I've worked with at least Elizabeth and Libby on different with different situations and stuff, and just found out how important this network, this team network, and getting that support behind you as your child looks at going into employment or being in the employment currently. So I'm going to turn it over to, I guess, Beth is up, and I'll let you introduce as you go, or each of you introduce yourselves.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Elizabeth Risner. I just celebrated my 8th year with the DD board. I'm the transition team supervisor. But before that, where my heart really is, I was the employment coordinator and worked a lot with Libby. So I'm glad that we get to work together again.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Libby Grove. I've gotten to work closely with Beth for many years, and I'm grateful that I am now back on her team. So I am the employment navigator, and I've been with Butler County Board of DD for almost 9 years. The first year and a half, I was an SSA, and then employment navigation kind of took off as we are an employment state, employment first state. And I've been fortunate enough to be in this role since then. And Vanessa, if you'd like to
I'm
introduce
Vanessa
yourself.
Elliot, and I am the Butler County Supervisor. So I guess anniversary is happening this month. I just celebrated 10 years with OOD. I was a counselor here in Butler County, and I went to be a supervisor in Hamilton County for a little bit, but came back because I do love Butler County, and this county has such an amazing gift for building those supportive teams. And so I think that that's something that we shine at. And so hopefully you can get some good tips.
Apologize. I am not so familiar with Zoom, so I'm trying to get to the next slide. Patty, if you wouldn't mind helping me out here.
Oh, here, I gotcha.
Thanks,
There you
Beth.
go.
That's why
I'm
she's
our driver today. Help us all.
So today we're here to talk about building a supportive network for your loved one and the individual that we serve. So throughout this presentation, you might hear different acronyms that we use that we're so familiar with using that it might be confusing if you're not familiar with them yourself. So number one, for what we as the County Board of Developmental Disabilities use, we often use Ohio ISP, which is the individualized service plan for each individual that we serve. Then we have the COEDI, which is the Ohio Eligibility Determination Instrument, and that is a scale that is used to see if the individual meets the requirements for our services. as well as a FED, which is the form of eligibility determination. And then, we're talking about transition age kiddos. So that is between the age of 14 and 22 years. And the reason why it is at that age is because in the state of Ohio, a person is able to get a part-time job as young as 14, and then they can be considered a transition age until the age of 22. Since we do have different programs that extend past that 12th senior year deadline that we often see. So, and then there's OODs.
Yeah. So for us, um, one thing I like to think is that when I first started seeing ISP, IPE, IEP, it's an alphabet soup there. That it's just a lot. So I started, as you can see, I italicized certain things like that's what it's for, and that kind of helped me remember what that particular agency was geared for. So for ours, IPE, it's the Individualized Plan for Employment, and just about all of our acronyms will have something about employment. And that's just because that is our mission and that's what we do. But we have pre-ets. You'll hear if your child has been involved with us, you'll hear pre-ets and transition and CWEs and CBAs. So that's kind of our way of saying pre-employment transition services. Those are those things where they're not ready for employment yet, but they could be getting there. And so that's kind of our soft launch into that employment setting. And CWE is a community work experience. Like where are we going? What are we trying out? This can be used for several things, but it's something that we'll usually use that to say some sort of assessment. And then a PE case, not a lot of people know about these, but we have potentially eligible. Um, Generally, this is for younger students, 14, but when we look at building that team and getting ready for that next step, sometimes a PE case is going to be more useful for the individual than going into a vocational rehabilitation case. Maybe they're just not ready for the intensity that would come from doing summer youth or something like that. So sometimes you might have a counselor that says, why don't we try a PE case? And that's just saying, why don't we try looking at that pre-employment transition services? Like, let's talk about work before we jump into it. And so those are our big ones. And then, of course, the school services, they have their own set of acronyms, but the biggest ones are usually IEP and that transition age. Um, so they kind of keep it in line with what we're doing as well.
All right. Well, lots of acronyms there, and I just learned about the PE case myself, so we're all going to learn something new in this. I think that's great. Okay, so let's talk now about the timeline of when to get together. So, IEPs are dictated by the individual's need for school services and can begin in early childhood school age. So typically for our agency, we look at school age from the ages of 4 to 13, but transition age 14 to 22 still in school. Begins transition services. They're going to identify goals and interest across various facets. And then ISPs, DD can be involved throughout the lifespan. So that's what I kind of like to toot our horn on. We are one of the few agencies around that are responsible for people from birth to death or as long as they want our services. Can provide community between school and OOD and looks at all aspects of an individual's needs. And then IPEs, time specific, focuses on transition to work, ready to learn about work more in depth, and geared towards vocational attainment. And then I love that Vanessa put in some graphics for us. So here, is a nice visual aid of what it looks like of all those different things coming together.
And then, of course, how and when to begin organizing the network team. This is probably one of the more complicated things because everybody is different. I wish we had the ability to just be like, this is the exact time that you guys should come in and do the intake and get started with us. But we know that that's not realistic for anybody, for any individual, because there's so much variety. And so we do kind of look at where is that individual at. And so jumping to that backwards planning, I always like to say, what is that long-term goal? What is the goal post education? Are we looking at a part-time, full-time? What does that look like, especially for us in the employment world? Because if we know kind of when that point is, we can work backwards for going, okay, this is how we're going to plan these services. This is how we're going to engage the individual so that they're actually moving along at a pace that is meaningful and it progresses, but doesn't overwhelm. And so that looks different for every individual in transition. Some people are ready to go at 14 and they're like, I'm just waiting to be able to get my part time job. And then others, maybe they need a little more time. They need the project life, project search models. They need a little extra beyond that. And that's okay. So we try to engage the parents and the individuals and say, what does that endpoint look like for that first job? At that very moment, at least if we can get that first job kind of narrowed down, we start having that conversation. Is it something that we're going to be involved at 14, or maybe do we need to wait a couple of years and then engage at like 16, 17? Does that make more sense for them? And that is an entirely individual conversation. And so that is something where if counselors know about IEP meetings, we'll have counselors go to the meeting even without a case being open, just so that we can get that background for that individual. So we get to know them and have a good idea of really where we're at and when we should engage. Because as you'll see in another slide, we're time limited on some things. So we want to make sure that we're making the best use of the individual's time, the family's time. We don't want to cause any kind of confusion as far as that progressive flow. And so one thing we do look at are individual factors. What are their specific barriers? What are things that they're going to need to work on? And what services do we have that may be able to mitigate that barrier? We're not the be all end all. And that's why we do say, hey, maybe have you reached out to DD? And sometimes DD will come to us, have you reached out to OD? So by no means are we the be all and end all for just us. There's a lot of community engagement. And so we'll look at all those different resources. And then specific supports. Every student's coming from a different place. They have different supports available and it's going to look different. So we'll take those into account as well. And then also the readiness for the next step. The biggest thing is we don't want to push somebody when they're not ready for it. That's just kind of counterproductive for us. So that's where we show up to meetings. Maybe they don't like new people. We'll get them used to seeing us before we're like, hey, why don't we go to work? Why don't we do this? So it's one of those things. If we have that backwards planning, we can kind of get an idea of who to bring in and when to bring them in. But it does look different for everybody. So we're big on just giving us a call, talking about your circumstances. There's no pressure. We're not going to sell you a case. So you can definitely call us and let us know what your circumstances are, and we can kind of help plan that whole path for you before we get started with anything.
Okay, so we're going to talk about eligibility now. So as Beth and Vanessa pointed out, Butler County Board of DD, we're here for life. We're a voluntary service, so we're not going to force or twist anyone's arm to work with us. But however, we are here for you and your individual loved one. And that starts from birth and goes on throughout their life. OOD is just they're time limited, like Vanessa said. Their primary focus and only focus is employment, and how do we help ensure the success of the individual and what different path might be appropriate for said person. So as far as eligibility goes, there have been times where you will find a person who has not been connected to Butler County Board of DD, but does meet the requirements for OOD. Typically speaking, from what I've experienced, 99.99% of the time, if someone meets the requirements for Butler County DD, they do for OOD and vice versa. With us, we recommend that you deem your loved one eligible as soon as possible, as soon as you get that concrete diagnosis from a physician. So that way it's done. We have you in our system. Even if we're not actively working with you or your loved one, you have been deemed eligible. So that way it's a lot smoother in the future for when you are ready to discuss with us where your loved one is at and what supports you believe they may need and what path they would be most successful taking at said time. Um, so the individual must live in the county of the application. So you can't, live in Hamilton County but apply for Butler County services. They would have to live in Butler County. These are separate from school documents. So if whatever you're getting from the school, what we would need is an official diagnosis from a physician. Um, the qualifying diagnosis of a developmental disability, and it has to take place before the age of 22. So if you suspect that your loved one might have challenges with comprehension or meet physical limitations or what have you, the sooner you get that diagnosis from the doctor on paper, the better, because after the age of 22, let's say they turn 23 and they finally get that concrete diagnosis, we're going to have a very difficult time, if at all, proving that they're eligible for our services. Um, must be likely to continue indefinitely as far as their diagnosis and must meet 3 areas of substantial functional limitations. So, Beth, I don't know if you want to piggyback off of anything I've said so far about eligibility or if we're good to.
Yeah, I think you did a great job of covering it. The main thing that I would add is that we do have a email for our eligibility team that I can drop in the chat, as well as a phone number. Those are going to be your experts within that area. And I will kind of reiterate what our employment supervisor always says. You're better off to go ahead and get eligible early, even if you feel you don't need the service, because what we don't want to have happen, and what we sometimes do have happen, is somebody will be in an emergency situation, such as, the hospital, and you need services quickly, and we don't want you to be in that predicament. We want you to be well prepared ahead of time. So that's the only additional I would share. And then I guess we can go over to OOD.
So I think that that's the one of the bigger points is that we do often get confused. So some folks will think that OOD is DD and DD is OOD. I blame branding. It truly is. We've got that acronym thing going on where they're very similar. And so sometimes folks will come to us a lot earlier and asking for things, and we are almost the opposite in the fact that if you're under 14, we can't take an application. So it's just not something we do. But some of the things we do is we go way past the onset of a disability. So it has to be a documented disability, so no change there, but we accept a very broad range of disabilities. And sometimes even if an individual isn't DD eligible, they'll be OOD eligible. For us, we can take school documents, and that's sufficient for us as far as eligibility goes. An onset of diagnosis can be at any time of life. It's not unusual for individuals to acquire a disability and then come to us for vocational rehabilitation. It does need to have a substantial barrier to employment. And so that is one thing that we tend to talk about is what are the barriers you're facing with work? And for transition students, that might be a little more complicated to answer because they're not sure, you know. And so we will look at things like where maybe have they struggled in school, have they had issues with interpersonal skills, and we look at that. So it's a lot broader for the transition students than it would be for somebody who's in their 40s, 50s, or 60s. Um, and yes, while our services are time limited, people can come back as much as they need to. And we'll talk some more about that. But also, the individual is presumed to benefit from VR services in terms of an employment outcome. So as long as we think that the services we can offer will be able to get a job, retain a job, we're going to be making that person eligible. And they have to require those services to gain or retain that employment. Um, it is we want people to be as independent as possible. So we do look at, do you need this service? And that's kind of a question that we always want to ask, because we don't want somebody to just come to us when they could do it themselves. We would prefer to, kind of be a coach and say, you know what, we've taught these skills. Let's have that ability to do it independently. And seeing how they kind of go through that. And I'd say that both agencies have similar services. They're called different things because, of course, we're not going to call it the same thing. They're similar, but they do differ in the scope of what a provider can and cannot do, the time frames of which they can do them, and also documentation requirements. I would say that OOD is a little more relaxed in our requirements, and because we are time limited, it just looks different.
All right. So now I get the fun slide. So now we're going to talk about the differences between waivers and local funding. So waivers, Medicaid, home and community-based service waivers, allow people with developmental disabilities to receive care in their home and communities instead of long-term care facilities, hospitals, intermediate care facilities. Medicaid, home and community-based waiver services allow people with developmental disabilities to receive care in their home and communities instead of these long-term care facilities or hospitals. So now let's go over the waiver types. I know a lot of us are probably familiar with these, but we'll just go for it. So we've got the individual options waiver, often known as the IO for short. The IO waiver is the more comprehensive waiver, and you're going to see that in people who need a lot of help in their home or for people who may need a variety of different services. Then we've got our lovely self-empowered life funding waiver, also known as the self waiver for short. This one kind of gives the individual the power. You're in charge of hiring, training the people you want. It's really about self-direction. Um, and then you can manage your budget within the way that you want, or you can appoint someone to help you do that. And then you've got your level one waiver, which is probably the most common that we all know. The level one is a good fit for people who do not need many paid supports or provide services. The level one relies heavily on natural supports working simultaneously with the waiver service providers. And then local funds. Um, the distinction about local funds is we have to be very fiscally responsible with those because they are funded 100% by the local tax dollars. Whereas the waivers, it's a 60-40 match. So the services that we typically fund with those are 1 day of adult day program, trips to and from work. That still remains intact, the trips to and from work. And then minimal individual employment support. So, for instance, let's say somebody closes with OOD and they still need some follow along services, then we would typically go ahead and authorize those services. Now, you may have heard we are in a fiscal emergency. So we really are trying to be mindful of what we're spending the local dollars on, and trying to make that spread as much as possible. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Vanessa to talk about OOD funding.
Thanks, Beth.
Mhm.
So with OOD, ours is a little different based off of the Rehab Act. So we get a mix of state and federal funding. So every 2 years, we go to the state of Ohio and we say, this is what we're doing, and this is what we're asking for. So for every dollar that the state gives to our agency, we get $3.69 from the federal government. And so they match that dollar to dollar. So obviously, it ebbs and flows. There's always going to be that piece. And I think that that's part of what really comes into that network is sometimes we have to balance off of each other to be able to make sure that we can provide as much as far as services go to all of the individuals that are needing those services. And so we do look at all of those pieces, like what can somebody provide? We go back to, what is the individual support, things like that. So that is something that we do look at when we're planning everything else. And so what happens is we look at core services versus ancillary services. And generally, we won't say that. We go by several different names, but really our core services are what services do we have to provide under voc rehab, so under vocational rehabilitation. And it has to directly relate to that individual's impairment from their disability into the workplace. So that would be your job development, your job coaching, summer youth assessments, those things that are very directly, we have a straight line of the impairment and the employment. And then ancillary services, I like to say those are the things that are nice to have and really make a huge difference. They're very helpful, but they are not necessarily 100% connected to the impairment or to employment. So those could be other things. So some examples are maintenance, like interview clothing. Yes, that's great. We need that. It's fantastic. And we can generally provide that, but it is a secondary service compared to that job development. So we might go, you know what, is there a way that we can get those clothes if that's something that we can't provide? And we might go, hey, dress for success. It is reaching out to a lot of those grassroots community services as well. So we don't necessarily always provide it right off the bat. We might look at other services from other agencies and organizations that will accomplish the same mission, but it's not within our core services. And then we said time limited. For us, that looks different for everybody. Some individuals may be on our caseloads for several years, especially if they join as students. We know that we're going to be with them through that high school experience if they start early. That said, we get folks that come back. Maybe, they had their initial entry job, which we said, when you're coming out of high school, you're going to have that first job. And we know that first job is not your last job. Nobody here is in the same job that they started as a teenager, early 20-something. And we know that. So we say, you know what, you're doing great at this job. We're going to step out of the picture for right now, but come back. When you're ready to get a new job, things like that. So even if we're not visually as part of the team, we remain part of the team. It's not unusual for people to call the counselor that they had when they closed and said, hey, I'm ready to move on. Let's get another case started. And we are always thrilled to do that. And I think I'm trying to remember the exact age, but we had somebody that was in their 90s and still looking for work. So we were like, okay, let's do this. If that interest and that drive is still there, they can come back as many times as they need to move on, to progress. And then services are determined by vocational needs of individual. Not everybody needs the same things. We go back to that, it's individualized plan. Some folks are going to need a little more and some may need a little less. So we do work off of what that individual is reporting to us that they need, whatever service it may be. They may need a little more coaching than their friend does. And that's okay. So we kind of look at that piece and we go back to the, we want them to learn these skills and become independent with these skills. So even it can even vary not only by the individual, but through multiple cases. That's one of those things where if you're doing well and you've learned how to do the job search, we may not have a job developer. We may help coach you through that because you already have that skill. So we always want to make sure that we're making that individual as independent as possible. So we want them to retain those skills as much as possible. And then I see there's a question in the chat. Are the Butler County DD waivers in Butler County the same in the other counties, or does that vary by county?
Every county has the same waivers, and there is one waitlist assessment that all the counties use. So that would be your first step. If you're interested in waiver services, you would want to reach out to your SSA and see how you would go about setting up that assessment.
And on that front, I would say that obviously OOD is a state agency, so we're in all 88 counties. If you have an open case in one county and you move, we can transfer your case. There's no need to get started again.
I would like to go back really quick to the Dress for Success. Every year, Libby hosts that event at our office, and it's one of our favorite days because if you've never seen it before or you've never had a chance to participate, they come in with a big truck with racks of clothing on it, all brand new. They have jewelry, purses, personal hygiene products, undergarments. I mean, they cover the whole thing. So, Libby, if there's anything else you wanted to share about that, I think it's a
Yes,
great
this is a
program.
wonderful, wonderful resource. They are based out of Cincinnati and they travel. They, like Beth said, they bring this big van, racks of clothes, and they ahead of time will send their information. They have this little personalized style questionnaire to learn about the person's preferred clothing, if they like shorts, long pants, skirts, dresses, just sizes. They also provide bras and underwear if needed. Shoe size, they prefer flats, so they prefer to dress as feminine, masculine, non-binary. They are absolutely wonderful. It's a team of women that come. They have these different outfits picked out based on the person's answers to the questions. So they get to go shopping. They try it. They have pop-up tents. They try it on. If they don't like it, there's rows and rows of clothes. They get to go shopping, try it on, and they get to leave with 6 different items. And that can include jewelry, shoes, purse. I mean, and one full outfit attire. And that is for that job readiness for job interviews. However, it is strictly for women. They do not take men. And if you have a loved, if your son or your nephew or grandson or whomever, your neighbor is a male and you're trying to get them connected to something similar, they do have resources for men. It just doesn't look the same as it does for women.
All right, thank you for sharing that. So here is all of our contact information. So feel free to give us a call. Did anybody have anybody else we need to add to that? I know I did say I would get the information for eligibility, so but there we all are.
And here are a few resources. Obviously, the eligibility criteria for DD and the intake checklist. Generally very helpful. Sometimes when we're working with individuals that are not connected, they're like, where do I start? So this is just a good, helpful information on that. And then OD pre-employment services and post-secondary information. This goes into the transition piece, but it also talks about that post-secondary, and it also goes into things like internships, apprenticeships. So obviously not everybody is going to go to college. And that's absolutely okay. There's other paths for that. There's a lot of they call them individual credentialing, things like that. There are multiple paths available, but they do go into all of that kind of information and what that might look like in some of our partners in that. And then oodworks.com breaks down not only the transition pieces, and if you're not connected with us, you can apply on that website, but it gives a lot of information as far as what our services kind of entail as a broader spectrum. Also, there's a huge library for employers. What does it look like to be an inclusive employer? What does it look like to kind of navigate that with employers? And so we do have a huge piece with that. And we do work with a lot of employers to teach like disability etiquette and kind of how do we take that next step to be as inclusive as possible. So there is a lot of that on there. So I find it very interesting. And it also goes into like our needs assessment. What are we doing well? What are we working on doing better with? But my biggest thing is always that we may not have the service that you need, but we will try to find that person. So it may not be directly involved with employment, but if you bring it up to a counselor, they're going to look for that resource. And a lot of people have made a lot of connections to try to figure out how can we best serve our individuals. So it doesn't hurt to throw it out and say, this is kind of what I'm looking at. You may stump us, but we'll try our best to find something. And so that's the biggest pieces of being part of the team, is that even if you don't have an open case or you're just trying to get more information for somebody else, call us. We'll try our best to point you in the right direction.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Those are definitely some great resources. And I know that you guys also have liaisons that send out job leads. We at DD try to make sure that those get out to all the SSAs so that they know who the employment partners are. And I also have utilized Cynthia Cruz, I believe it was, for helping with navigation of employer training, because we have some employers that they really do want to hire the people that we support, but they don't necessarily, they want more training to be inclusive. So I think that that's great that you guys offer that. All right. So we've done a lot of talking, but now we can open it up to you guys and answer any questions that you might have. And I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen to make it more personalized.
I want to present a question, and then whoever else is on, think of your questions that we can ask them as well. I will stop the recording here in a few minutes, so you can just ask openly and not worried about getting recorded, or you can put it in the chat box. It's fine too. But one item I want to identify when you're talking about bringing in the county board or OOD into whether you're at an IEP level or ISP level, are the parents to know to invite them, or are they suggested? Is there will the counselor or whoever is excuse me, heading the session, the meeting, I would suggest inviting OOD, or I suggest inviting your county board. How do parents know to invite them or connect them into these meetings, the IEP and the ISP meetings?
Absolutely. I can speak to OOD's part. Our counselors we have transition specific counselors, and so they work with all the schools in the area. And so we talk with those intervention specialists, we talk with the transition coordinators. So usually it does come from the instructor, talking to the parents. Can I invite OOD? Can I invite DD? Because we don't want to surprise the parent, like, hey, here's a whole new person that you don't know. But if we're getting that invite and we have the ability to do it, we'll jump into that meeting and just introduce ourselves. And sometimes parents are like, well, I don't think my child's ready for that yet. Excellent. Here's my contact. If you want to talk to me at a different point, that's fine. If not, we've had instructors that will invite us to multiple IEPs throughout their time in high school, and that's absolutely fine.
And then so from our end, I have to give a shout out to the parent mentors. We have a wonderful group of parent mentors that if they see a family that's having a barrier or they think might be eligible for the services, they do a great job of reaching out to myself directly, sometimes Latundra directly, to see what we can do for them. We have good relationships with, Hamilton High School, the Lakotas, Middletown. A lot of times they will email me and say, hey, can you attend this meeting? And so we get a lot of good interaction just from the teachers themselves. And we try to do what we can to, set up our booths, get the word out. And just really, and sometimes it's with other parents, that they'll be working with an SSA and they'll mention, give out my number or give my email, and then that's another good way to get started.
Is that website for them? Is that the Ohio Parent Mentor Project? Is that one, or is it that one's osu.edu? Is that the right one for the Parent Mentors site? Because I know
I
there'll be different people from different counties, and there's parent mentors all over, Ohio. I just want to make sure they can connect.
Yeah, I believe it is, but I'll double check and ask, just to make sure that we're giving them good information.
Okay.
Because usually they'll just email me directly, and I don't really know that as far as outside counties how they would get in touch.
And if you're a parent on here, that's one thing that I didn't realize you can invite people to your IEP meetings in school. And especially if you're going into the employment, having OOD there and the county board, getting to know your child before they go out into the employment world. It's so nice to have that team around you. And then if you can invite a parent mentor in as well, that's great. I mean, the more, to me, in those meetings, the more the merrier. I'm not sure. I guess that's just a cliche, I guess. But the more eyes or the more ears you have on your meeting, the more questions and things that can come up that maybe you as a parent didn't think about. So, um, I would definitely invite these different organizations as you prepare for that transition into employment. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. So if anybody wants to unmute, they can just to ask questions. But I want to thank you guys, all three of you, Elizabeth, or Beth, and Libby, and Vanessa for presenting tonight on, building the supportive network team. I found that it was so crucial when we were going through transition and employment, and it's such a helpful tool to use at this stage of transition. Life is a transition, but there's so many different stages. But this particular one, going from that high school into employment, but then you have you have county board with you the whole way, and then OOD is we opened and closed a couple cases as he changed jobs, and they were always there for us throughout this process. So I want to thank you guys for presenting and providing the contact information. And I'm going to close the recording at this time so people can ask their questions. But thank you.
Yes, thank you.